Well, I've been debating with this guy about geology and evolution, a bunch of other things. You can't stay in one subject at a time. He loves to Gatling gun people like me, but he's surprised I have all the answers if he gives me a chance to answer them. But I had to do my study. I had to do my homework, and his questions aren't all that in depth. But he's going into the presupposed geologic timetable, which I have to accept as a given. Well, that's the first problem. You don't accept anything as a given until there's evidence that produces something that's reliable, that's at least plausible. The rock systems of geology and their corresponding geologic ages have for many years been worked up in the form of an erroneous geologic timetable. Such a presentation obviously indicates a gradual progression of life from the simple to the complex, from lower to higher, and therefore implies organic evolution. It also implies from less complex to more complex, which, ask Isaac Newton, it's devolving, not evolving. This is considered by geologists to be tremendously important and a tremendously important key to the interpretation of geologic history. Modern biologists, in turn, regard this presupposed and falsified geologic record as the cornerstone of their hypothesis of organic evolution. It is common to read statements in biologic literature to the effect that, although modern biological research has been unable to agree on the method by which evolution is brought about genetically, or to provide examples of evolution occurring on any large scale today, it is nevertheless proved to be a fact by the paleontologic record. So, it goes on to say, evolution of the animal and plant world is considered by all those entitled to judgment to be a fact for which no further proof is needed. Wow. But in spite of nearly a century of work and discussion, there is no unanimity in regard to the details of the means of evolution. Now this is Richard Schmidt. Evolution is viewed by one geneticist, American scientist. Some of these articles are older. Haven't found anything new. Leave it the way it is. Science facts are facts. It is true that nobody thus far has produced a new species or genus by macromutation. It is equally true that nobody has produced even a species by the selection of micromutations. In the best-known organisms, like Drosophila, innumerable mutants are known. If we were able to combine 1,000 or more of such mutants in a single individual, this would still would have no resemblance whatsoever to any type known as a new species in nature. Watch my lips. No new species. Things are devolving. Thank you, Isaac Newton. And the following quotation indicates the emphasis the evolutionist places on his false interpretation of the fossil record to largely prove out his false model of evolution. They're forcing out of the textbooks the rock strata to be in the order that it appears in the textbooks all over the world, and is simply not the case. It's so different out there in the real world compared to the textbook. It's ridiculous. Although the comparative study of living animals and plants may give very convincing circumstantial evidence, fossils provide the only historical documentary evidence that life has evolved from simpler to more complex forms. Thank you, Dr. Isaac Newton, right? He says differently. Here's Carl O. Dunbar, Historical Geology. In actuality, the fossil record proves that all life is complex, with many similarities shared among species, and all species living contemporaneously. These quotations from outstanding evolutionary authorities, get this, I'm quoting the opposite camp to what I think. These quotations from outstanding evolutionary authorities, both in geology and biology, demonstrate the great importance of the paleontological record to the theory of evolution. In turn, the principles of evolution and uniformity are seen to be of paramount importance in the correlation of the geologic strata. These principles are absolutely basic, both from the point of view of the history of the development of modern geology and from that of present interpretation of geologic field data. The circular reasoning here should be evident, and indeed is evident, even to many historical geologists. How old are the fossils? They're as old as the rocks. Sorry for the noise. And how old are the rocks? He said, how old are the fossils? They're as old as the rocks. How old are the rocks? They're as old as the fossils. Isn't that a circle? Which came first? I don't know. The circular reasoning here should be evident, and indeed is evident even to many historical geologists. For example, let's take a look at R.H. Rostall, lecturer in economic geology at Cambridge University. Not an unknown university there. And this is what he says. I underline it a little bit. It cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. Amen. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of organisms that they contain. And this article is in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It is maintained by many stratigraphers, individuals studying the origin, composition, succession, and distribution of rock data. That's what they're defined as. That other factors, especially that of superposition, layered positions of the strata, are also important in geologic correlation, and that in general these factors justify the usual assignment of ages to strata on the basis of their fossil contents. The usual situation, however, is that only a few formations are ever superposed in any one locality, and that it is very difficult or impossible to correlate data of different localities by this principle of superposition. Here's what I'm saying. The rock strata is different everywhere you go. So you say this rock is as old as the fossil in it, and you go to another position there, someplace else on the planet, maybe go to Britain, and find that the superposition of the fossil is different. So the fossils have different ages according to whether they're in Britain, or in Spain, or in Canada, or in America. Really. The fossils must be resorted to, and the fossil sequence is falsely assumed to accord with the principle of evolution. Furthermore, even where superposed strata are exposed, it rather often happens that the fossils appear in reverse order from that demanded by the evolutionary history, which paradox is commonly explained by the assumption, without proof, that the strata have been folded or faulted out of their original sequence. Matter of fact, I read about somewhere in this article about a line of rock strata that goes for hundreds of miles in Pennsylvania. But the problem is the rock strata above it doesn't belong above it, it belongs below it. They say, well, it was uplifted. You know what uplifting is? You lift up tons and tons and tons of material and then shove something underneath it and then slam it down on top of it. But that line of rock strata went for miles with no rubble, no evidence of any violence of that sort at all. Consider this statement by Schubert and Dunbar, Outlines of Historical Geology. In any particular region, the sequence of geologic events is clearly shown by the order of superposition and undeformed sedimentary formations. Evolutionists, by the use of the word undeformed in the context above, indicate that they only consider formations as normal, which do not contradict the other order indicated in their falsified geologic timescale established and upheld by themselves. The other formations without evidence, the other formations which are innumerable, they classify arbitrarily and falsely as deformed. Actually, they are not deformed at all, but are just an expected sedimentary deposit of a flooded condition on the earth, be it a worldwide flood or local flood. That's how things are deposited. Just take a big jar of water that you can see through and put a bunch of different kinds of dirt and sizes and colors and shake it up, and it'll come down pretty much the same way every time, because sphericity and density determine the order in which things are deposited. Now, if you have different things appear in different places in different ways, you had different floods sequences. Waves come out and slam into other waves, deposit their stuff. Then that's settled. And then another wave and another hits another wave over that same area. Now is a different order because there are different things in the wave. Of course, there are many places where the succession has been locally inverted by folding or interrupted by faulting. But such exceptions will betray themselves in the evidences of disturbance and in the unnatural succession of the fossil. See, so when you say, "Well, this is this is deformed," say why? The fossils are in a different order than expected, and there's no sense of disturbance. Just seems to be there. However, this is not the case that was just said. Evidence of disturbances are not found when fossils so repeatedly, frequently occur out of the expected order. Consider what Schindorf says. Let me underline that. Makes it easier to read. The sedimentary rocks by themselves, however, do not yield any specific time marks, setting aside the old law of superposition, which can provide relative age indicators only in a restricted manner, and which is unfit for age correlations. Yeah. Moreover, it may be misleading in some cases. The beds in a section may be overturned or, owing to a hidden thrust plane, older beds may overlie younger ones. You know, there's a lot of violence there. Where's the rubble for the violence? The only chronometric scale applicable in geologic history for the stratigraphic classification of rocks and for dating geological events exactly is furnished by the fossils. Owing to the irreversibility of evolution, they offer an unambiguous timescale for relative age determinations and for worldwide correlations of rocks. Wow. Really, you think that's the case? Schindorf comments on some stratigraphic terms in the American Journal of Science. Okay. In other words, the geologic and fossiliferous formations in real life hardly ever conform to the falsely fabricated geologic timetable of the evolutionist that appears in so many textbooks. So they resort instead to arbitrary and false assignments of specific ages to specific fossils without any proof, never considering the possibility that all life forms were created in the beginning. So they got their own ideas. They say, well, yeah, but those fossils in another strict area of the world appear in a different order in a different rock strata. Therefore, they're that age according to that rock strata. Who said that one? That one's the right one. The basis for the apparent great strength of the present system of historical geography is here clearly seen. Provision is made ahead of time for any contrary evidence that might be discovered in the field. The geologic time sequence has been built up primarily on the tacit assumption of organic evolution, which appears in the textbooks, which theory in turn derives its chief support from the geologic sequence thus presented as actual historical evidence of the process when it is not consistent throughout the world. Fragments of the sequences thus built up often appear legitimately superposed in a given exposure. But there are never more than a very few formations exposed at any one locality, occupying a very small portion of the geologic column. Formations from different localities are integrated into a continuous sequence almost entirely by means of the principle of organic evolution. You force it, if it agrees with the textbook, it's formed properly. If not, it's deformed, an exception. And when, as frequently occurs, strata are found superposed, but with the fossils in the inverse order, this paradox is resolved by saying that the strata must have been inverted through folding, whether or not there is any physical evidence thereof. When superposed strata are found with intervening systems missing, this is explained by the assumption of a corresponding period of erosion rather than deposition. Oh, the fossils eroded out. Wow. This neatly packaged system of geologic interpretation has the effect of making it practically impossible ever to dislodge it by any amount of contrary evidence. No matter what you come up with, they give you some kind of an excuse. Geological excuse, not history. The claim is merely made by evolutionists that it's possible to interpret geology in terms of slow processes